trials. Then we have Jenna, who's a partner at Ashira, whose first book on disability rights in India was just published by Oxford University Press. Tasneem, who graduated from the National Law School in Bangalore and is currently clerking at the Supreme Court. And Minal, who's on your screen, who's just finishing his GST at Yale on the sentencing of sexual offences in India. And Minal actually taught me criminal law. So we'll begin with Minal because he's already here, and then we'll log off, and then we'll go to the others. But maybe we could get the panelists to sit here if that's possible.
Thanks, Sudhir, for inviting me to present at the conference through Skype. I'm sorry I couldn't be there myself in person because of conflict engagement that I have here at Yale. So I'll be talking today, as Sudhir has asked me to, on my doctoral project on sentencing in rape in India. And I've been asked to focus on the methodological aspects of my project. But before getting into that, I'll have to give you a brief background of what my project is about, which will then lead to the empirical study that I've done on rape sentencing in India. So if you look at the history of sentencing discretion in various parts of the world, you see that there's a fascinating history, there's a cyclical history of courts having absolutely no discretion in sentencing in the 18th, 19th century, then going to a situation where they had absolute discretion in the 20th century, and then you come back into the late 20th century and the 21st century, and you go back to situations where courts have curtailed or no discretion in sentencing. So that's broadly how the history of sentencing discretion plays out. So if you look at Britain, we know that they had the mandatory death penalty for a lot of offences initially in the early 19th century. And then as the death penalty was removed for most offences, judges had the discretion to sentence offenders from a period of a few days to imprisonment for life. So they had absolute discretion to sentence for these offences for which there was no death penalty. The other interesting thing in the British context was that judges there was no appellate review of sentencing, and judges were not required to give reasons for the sentences that they imposed. So in effect, there was no accountability to judges with respect to sentences that they imposed. And this led to wide-scale disparity in sentencing. The sentence that the offender got depended on the region that he or she came from, the judge that the person was before, ethnic and racial differences, as well as gender played out in sentencing in Britain. This led to the establishment in 1907 of the Court of Criminal Appeal. And the Court of Criminal Appeal then became an appellate body which looked at sentences of the court subordinate to it, and the effort was to correct the sentences in situations where the subordinate court had gotten it wrong, or to lay down principles of sentencing as they went forward. That position remained constant for the next 8 decades till 1991, when the British Parliament started making efforts to curtail the judicial discretion in sentencing because they felt that there was a disparity in sentencing. Over the last 20 years, there's been a lot of flux in the sentencing systems in Britain. In 2009, the Coroners and Justice Act was passed, where a sentencing commission was set up for England and Wales with the mandate of laying down sentencing guidelines. This was preceded in 2003 by the Criminal Justice Act, which had set up the Sentencing Guidelines Council, which has, over the last 6 years that it was working, has also come out with various sentencing guidelines. The history in the United States is also similar to Britain, and the one major difference in the United States was that there was no appellate review of sentencing. So judges sitting alone determined sentence, and that was it. So there was no appellate review like in Britain. In the 1960s and the 70s, in the US, you see the theory of reformation being the favored theory. And since reformation was the favored theory, it meant that the understanding was that a person who committed crime did so because of exact period of punishment that they would impose on this person, and it would be up to the parole board to decide on the exact term of imprisonment that the person would ultimately undergo. So in the 1970s, you have a situation where the liberals in the US felt that the offenders were being kept in jail for extended periods of time, and it was being decided arbitrarily by parole boards. And at the same time, the conservatives felt that the offenders were being kept in prison for very short periods of time, and therefore they should increase the sentences and there should be certainty in sentencing. At the same time, a federal judge, Marvin Frankel, wrote a book in the 1970s talking about how there is chaos in sentencing in the federal system and there's a need for sentencing guidelines. So he advocated having an administrative body which would lay down sentencing guidelines, and the court would have to follow those sentencing guidelines. So based on all these debates that happened in the 1970s, you had various states of the US in the late 70s, early 80s coming up with sentencing guidelines, and for the federal level, Congress passed the Sentencing Regulation Act in 1984, which introduced the federal sentencing guidelines in the US. The model that is prevalent in the US as compared to Britain is the US uses numerical guidelines where you look at offense history levels on one axis, and then you have points for various offenses on the vertical axis, and the term of imprisonment is determined by the grid in which both these axes intersect. Judges hardly had any discretion. They could not go outside of the sentencing range that the guidelines recommended unless they gave reasons for doing so, and the reasons that they could give were also curtailed. So this was a system where basically judges had absolutely no discretion. So various other common law countries have also had sentencing guidelines movements happening at the same time. And in India, interestingly, if you look at the Malimat Committee report in 2003, it recommends that sentencing guidelines be introduced. And this was and then endorsed in 2007 by the Menon Committee as well. Now, both these reports don't talk about whether there's been any study or any reason why they think sentencing guidelines should be introduced. They just say that because these guidelines have been introduced in other parts of the world, and obviously sentencing is a problem, sentencing disparity is a problem that India faces as well. There's a need for sentencing guidelines. So this is where my project comes in. In my project, I examine whether there is actually a disparity in sentencing in India and whether there is a need for sentencing guidelines. I also look at if there's actually a need for sentencing guidelines, what do we learn from these various models that have been tried out in the United States, in Britain, in some states of Australia, Israel, and some other countries. I also chose the offense of rape to study whether there's sentencing disparity for three reasons. First is that, as you know, for the offense of rape, there's a minimum sentence. 376(1) provides a minimum sentence of 7 years, and 376(2) of the IPC provides a minimum sentence of 10 years. So the moment you have minimum sentences, at least you have a range within which judges can sentence, and there's sentencing theory which says that if ranges are provided, then the disparity is not widespread. And disparity, when I say disparity, I mean that like cases are not treated alike, and unlike cases are treated differently, and whether there is fairness and rule of law in sentencing is what I mean when I use the term disparity. The second reason why I was looking at rape law is, again, rape is a site of stereotyping, an offense where various extraneous considerations go into adjudication, and this has been studied across the world. And my interest was in seeing whether some of these stereotypes and rape myths which come into the adjudication process have impacted the sentencing process as well. The third and reason why I chose to look at rape sentencing is because most of sentencing theory does not touch upon the thorny issue of sentencing in rape, and this is probably because when you look at sentencing, work on sentencing guidelines, most of them are accused-centric. They look at the rights of the accused, whether accused have been kept in prison for extended periods of time. And so with rape being like an offense where the victim is the center of the entire trial process, jurists find it difficult to reconcile the arguments that they make for other offenses with the arguments that they make in rape. So this is broadly an introduction to the context of the project. And before going into the empirical bit, I need to quickly mention that I have a chapter which looks at substantive law of rape, in which I study the Supreme Court's jurisprudence on sentencing in rape, specifically the issue of the sole testimony of the victim and whether that is sufficient to convict the offender. The Supreme Court, in the process of laying down its jurisprudence on this issue, also came up with tests to determine the veracity of the victim, and in the process, I argue, created a stereotypical rape victim. Now, this stereotypical rape victim, if unmarried, would be a virgin and would be very apprehensive of marriage prospects, which would have been influenced because of the fact that she was raped. When she's testifying in court, she would be visibly traumatized and she would be crying, and because of those reasons, the court should believe her. On the other hand, someone who's not showing any emotion might not be believed. Then the Supreme Court has repeatedly said that a rape victim feels a sense of quote-unquote deathless shame. So if this sense of deathless shame is not felt, then it might be that she is not actually testifying the truth. The final issue is on medical evidence, and if you look at textbooks of medical jurisprudence, be it classics like Modi or the other textbooks like Parikh and others, which are used regularly in Indian courts, you see that they advocate the using of various methods to figure out whether penetration has occurred or not, and these methods also end up testing for virginity. Now, as you know, the Section 155, subsection 4 of the Indian Evidence Act, which made past sexual history of a rape victim relevant in criminal trials, was repealed in 2003. However, as studies with respect to rape shield laws in other countries have shown, defense lawyers find a way of introducing sexual history using other pieces of evidence, and in India, I argue that this is being done using doctors' reports, and sexual history is still being introduced and is still considered relevant in rape trials, though it's prohibited because of prohibited by evidence law. So in my empirical study, I wanted to see whether the site of rape stereotyping has moved from the guilt adjudication phase to the sentencing phase. And to do this, my data set consisted of all cases decided by all the high courts and the Supreme Court of India between 1983, when the rape law amendments came into force, and 2009. I used the Criminal Law Journal for the purpose of consistency, and this produced around 700 cases decided by high courts and around 100 cases decided by the Supreme Court. So
Yeah. Carry on.
The mic is.
Send him a symbol.
Just carry on.
The mic is on.
Okay, right. So I was saying that I used the Criminal Law Journal for the purpose of consistency, and it gave me 100 Supreme Court cases and around 700 cases decided by high courts, and I considered the entire population. I didn't take any samples from within the cases reported in the Criminal Law Journal. I didn't want to look at district court judgments, so I approached the district court in Bangalore to see if I could get those cases, and I was told, and I was given these cases as well, that between 2006 and 2009,
Carry on, sorry.
okay, between 2006 and 2009, there were 60 cases which were decided in the Bangalore District Courts, out of which there were 6 convictions. Out of the 6 convictions, 4 cases had been appealed, and the procedure when cases are appealed is that the entire file goes to the High Court. So since these matters were sub judice, the files could not be given to anyone. So there was not enough data to study district court judgments. So therefore I could not go into district court judgments as well. So I first did a pilot study where I looked at the cases decided in 2007 by all the high courts, and based on this pilot study I found that there are 4 factors which I need to look at in detail. One was location of the crime, whether the crime took place in an urban or a rural setting. Second was, just as I mentioned earlier, factors related to past sexual history, chastity and such. Third was nature of evidence and other evidence-related factors which came up before courts. And last, the theories of punishment that was used by the sentencing courts. Based on these, I formulated 28 questions which I would ask on every case that I was studying. And I divided these 28 questions into broadly 4 headings. First was looking at preliminary facts mentioned by the court in its judgments, including things like age, marital status of the victim and the defendant, relationship between the victim and defendant, etc. Then factors that were considered by the court in adjudicating guilt, like whether conviction was based on sole testimony, whether medical evidence was available, whether forensic evidence was available and was used by the court. Then factors expressly considered by the court in mitigating the sentence or aggravating the sentence. And lastly, the sentence imposed, which was the dependent variable that I was using. So I numerically coded the answers to each 28 independent variables, and then analyzed the data using the statistical software's data. I used multiple regression analysis controlling for various factors, and I determined these factors by using a correlation matrix and by on the basis of my hypothesis as to what factors would be related to each other. And I report only on the findings only if they're statistically significant, where the p-value is less than 0.05. In addition to looking at the statistical data and the regression results, I also use case studies, and using both of these I make my argument, which basically is I broadly come to 3 conclusions. The first is that stereotyping and rape myths have percolated from the guilt adjudication phase to the sentencing phase of the trial. And there are 2 other causes for disparity in sentencing, that is inconsistency in the use and application of theories of punishment, and consideration of irrelevant factors by courts while sentencing, and inconsistent application of relevant factors where they need to look at these relevant factors. For instance, I found, again, my results on this go up to around 40-50 pages, so I can't really talk about it in this time. So I will quickly talk about 5 things that I found. First was, I found that marital status, for instance, has a very important, plays a very important role in the sentence given to the defendant. I mean, marital status of the victim. Courts have articulated that if the victim is unmarried, the quote-unquote value that she loses because of being raped should lead to higher sentences being given to the defendant. So a woman being married has been used as a mitigating factor in a number of cases. Even the Supreme Court has articulated this. And through statistical analysis, I found that it does play a significant role in sentencing. I also found that chastity-related factors like the state of the hymen or whether the doctor conducted what is known as the 2-finger test, the results of those tests had a correlation with the sentence imposed. If the doctor had concluded that the woman was not a virgin, if she was unmarried and not a virgin when she was raped, then the sentences of the defendant who raped automatically reduced. I also found that the absence of injuries on the body of the victim was considered a mitigating factor. Sentences reduced when the injuries were absent in the body of the victim. Of course, the presence of injuries in the body of the victim is considered an aggravating factor, but the fact that the absence of injuries was considered mitigating was something that was very disturbing. The third was in the context of relationship between the defendant and the victim, the rape myth that stranger rape is more traumatic than rape by an acquaintance is something that Indian courts seem to follow and take up wholeheartedly, because cases where the victim was raped by a stranger, the sentences are much higher than cases where the defendant is an acquaintance of the victim. Cases of elopement are treated very differently. In situations where the victim and the defendant have eloped, and then the victim complains of rape, the sentences always were around 2 years or 3 years, and this was a major factor that was playing into the sentences being given by the judges. And with respect to theories of punishment, like I mentioned earlier, one of the issues that I found that was inconsistent use and application of theories of punishment, I found courts articulating what I call the theory of the ends of justice, where courts talk about how the sentence that they're giving will meet the ends of justice. And most of these cases, you see that sentences actually are much below the minimum of 7 years. And the ends of justice is used as a theory of rationalization. If the court feels uncomfortable in convicting the accused, but has to do so because of precedents of the Supreme Court, and it appears that their hands are tied, then they get into this theory of ends of justice and say that ends of justice would be met if the person is sentenced to whatever period of time they sentence him ultimately to. The last point that I found was that question of mitigating factors. What do you consider mitigating for the offense of rape? For instance, should the young age of the defendant be considered mitigating in rape? And again, there's a lot of debate on this issue across sentencing theory. And Indian courts don't really get into this debate, and you see courts articulating that young men could not control their passions, so therefore sentences should be reduced on that ground, not on the accepted ground that possibly a person who's younger in age, if you use the theory of reformation, can be reformed rather than someone who's much older in age, or using the theory of deterrence in the context of an older person. So this is broadly what I found in my empirical analysis, and going forward my project looks at whether sentencing guidelines are at all the solution to the problem that exists in rape sentencing in India, and also examining how other countries have dealt with similar problems. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mrinal. I don't think we take questions from Mrinal, because that's just going to be a little complicated. But I mean, I'll send you guys his email address, and you should be able to write to him. So thanks so much.
Can you hear it? You should tell Mrinal that.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Typical evidence in criminal trials. So look forward to that.
Thank you very much for the invitation. So my topic today is at the junction of two phenomena that we are witnessing happening, especially in the Anglo-American criminal justice system in the last 30 years. So on the one hand, we see a steady attack against traditional forms of evidence, eyewitness testimony and fingerprints, both in the academic literature and slowly also in the decisions of other courts. On the other hand, we see a steady rise of new forms of quantitative and statistical and mathematical evidence. And at the junction of these two phenomena, I think a few interesting policy questions arise. So what I will do is just describe these two phenomena today, and I raise a few questions. I have no answer to them. Okay, so first, this attack against traditional forms of evidence, eyewitness testimony and fingerprints. Let me give you just two examples. of findings that the academic literature gives us about why these two forms of evidence are problematic. There is a very interesting experiment where subjects are shown a scene with people playing basketball. And the experimenter asked the subject, well, count how many times the people playing pass the ball to each other. So you look at it, and you might manage to count how many times they do pass the ball to each other. And at the end of the video, the experimenter asked, so how many times did the ball go from the hands of one to another player? And well, some people say, I don't know, some people get it right, some people get it wrong. And then the experimenter says, did you notice maybe no mind. Did you notice the giant gorilla that made its appearance many times during the game? And most people say, no, I didn't notice it. So this shows that even if you're really focused, and you can get the video on YouTube and do it for yourself, you just type gorilla selective attention and you get this. So the main point is that even if you're really focused on what is going on, you don't notice extremely important and clear details like a giant gorilla. And you see the consequence of this for an eyewitness. Coming to fingerprint. Fingerprint has been for a long time the gold standard for criminal evidence. If you find a fingerprint on the crime scene and they match the fingerprint of the suspect, and there is an argument such as that trace, the fingerprint trace, could not have been there innocently, well then the suspect must have been the perpetrator. And why is the basis for that? Well, the basis is that fingerprints are either very, very rare, so they're not shared by two people, or they are unique, something like that. Well, there is no scientific basis for that claim. Fingerprints aren't unique, or actually we don't know whether they're unique or not. A second interesting finding is that very highly trained fingerprint experts were asked to tell whether the same pair of fingerprints matched, and they were asked multiple times in different circumstances. Well, it turned out that one time they said yes, it matches, the two pairs match, and another times they said no, they don't. So it seems there is an extremely high degree of variability, arbitrariness behind all these things. And there are many other things that you could say, but the point is that as a consequence of that, the legal literature has turned to try to explore ways in which this problem can be countered. And there are essentially three ways in which the academic literature has, especially in the United States and in the UK, has addressed this problem. On the one hand, just calling for better training of legal professionals. Second is to make rules of admissibility for eyewitness and fingerprint evidence more stringent. And the third way is to introduce rules of weight, for example, saying that convictions cannot be based on one single piece of eyewitness evidence. There must be two pieces of eyewitness evidence. So one single piece of uncorroborated fingerprint evidence is not enough. No matter what we decide which way we want to go, except if we go the first way, which is a better training of legal professionals, but this way is going to take an entire generation to see its benefit. Well, so if we take one of the last two ways, either rules of weight or stricter standards of admissibility, well, the result is there will be some sort of evidential vacuum in the criminal justice system. And so the problem is what to do with it. So that concludes the first phenomena and the problem that it raises. Now for the second, the statistical evidence. Now you could say, well, as we witness the decline of traditional forms of evidence, we also witness the rise of statistical and quantitative evidence. So, well, quantitative evidence could take the place of traditional forms of evidence. Why not? And it seems, well, it is more reliable, it is more scientific, it quantifies precisely the margins of error. So it has all the advantages that traditional forms of evidence doesn't have. And what I want to say, well, not so fast. So let me give you a case to illustrate what I think is one of the problems with statistical evidence. So it's a British case that has stirred very much controversy in the UK, and it was discussed at the end of the 19th century. Sorry, at the end of the 20th century, beginning of the 21st century. Sally Clark's children, a few months old, both died at the presence of their mother. The first baby died in 1996, the second in 1998, and Sally was arrested and charged with murder. At trial, the pediatrician Roy Meadow testified that the probability of 2 accidental consecutive cot deaths in a family similar to the Clarks was 1 in 73 million. And that probability was thought to be very impressive to rule out the possibility that the 2 deaths occurred accidentally or because of natural causes. And then the conclusion was that, well, then the mother must have done it. The mother was convicted in 2000. She appealed in 2003, but the first conviction was upheld, and then she appealed again in 2003, and finally she was released on the ground that the statistics were flawed and been misinterpreted. Now, one issue that has been very much debated in this case is, well, look, statistics should be correct, should be properly interpreted, should be supplied by the court by good statistician and highly trained expert witnesses. This is all, it should be that way. But the issue that interests me here is slightly different. My concern is on what to do if the statistics were correct and properly interpreted. So if, based on statistical evidence alone, the probability that Sally Clark intentionally killed her children was very, very high, then should we convict her or not? Are we supposed to be troubled about the conviction based on just statistical evidence or not? So this is the question I want to ask, and my answer is that, well, we should be troubled. Even if the statistical evidence is untainted by misinterpretation or unsound data, we should be troubled. Why? 2 points that are connected to each other. First, notice that the statistical evidence against Sally Clark lacked any significant degree of specificity and individualization. It did not provide any information about how Sally killed her babies, why she did it, when exactly the killing occurred, etc. And even at its best, it did not provide any information about who committed the killing. It only asserted that, well, some must have done. Why the mother? So that's the first point. Statistical evidence tends to lack a sufficient degree of specificity and individualization. As a consequence of this, Sally Clark could hardly defend herself. She only had 2 options for defending herself when confronted with this kind of evidence. The first option was to show that the statistics were flawed. The second option was that, well, there was other evidence that showed that she was innocent. But unfortunately, she wasn't able really to find any other evidence really showing that she was innocent. And the only things that she could do is to show that the statistics were flawed. But as I told you before, my question is, what if the statistics were not flawed? Then she wouldn't have any avenue for a defense. So Sally Clark, in a sense, even if she had to wait until the second appeal, was lucky enough. The statistics were flawed, she could object to that, she was released. If the statistics were not flawed, she wouldn't have any avenue for a defense, or nearly no opportunity to defend herself, despite possible innocence. Just to make this all a little more general, the reason why statistical evidence is troublesome is that, first, it lacks typically any significant degree of specificity and details. And as a consequence, a prosecutor's case that is based on statistical evidence only will tend to be very vague and unspecified. Although it might make the defendant's guilt very highly probable. And when the defendant is confronted with a case that is underspecified, the defendant has a very hard time responding to it. In contrast to that situation, if the prosecutor offers more details about the crime, well, the defendant can rebut to every single point, to every single claim, has many more avenues, many more avenues to defend himself. And this is interesting because when I witnessed the fingerprint evidence I used to incriminate defendants, despite all the problems that we have talked about before, well, typically more details about the crime will be available. And so the defendants will be able to defend themselves more easily. An eyewitness will tell many things about what happened, how, in what place, what circumstances, and fingerprints. And a fingerprint expert will probably offer a rather detailed reconstruction of the case. So now let me come at the conclusion, which is an attempt to join these two phenomena and raising a few questions. So statistical evidence, I think, is not troublesome because it hampers the trial goal of error minimization of accuracy. Actually, there is an argument that I will not rehearse here to conclude that statistical evidence does improve the accuracy of the trial system, does improve the goal of error minimization. It kind of depends on what we mean by probability, what we mean by accuracy, what we mean by error minimization, but let's set all this aside. But the trouble with statistical evidence, so it's not at the epistemic or accuracy level, but it concerns the fact that it consigns defendant to unfair situation in which they have nearly no opportunity to exercise the defense. Now here is where the policy question begins to arise, which is how much space we should accord to statistical evidence depends on how extensively we want to protect defendants' possibility to exercise the defense, and how we intend to balance this protection with another very important trial goal, which is accuracy, which is error minimization. So here it seems that we have a conflict between diverging values and many other values. These are just two values of the main conflict. On the one hand, we want to protect the interest of defendant by individuals, and it is natural to think of the possibility to exercise the defense is a natural way to guarantee that protection. On the other hand, we want to foster the long-term trials goals of error minimization and accuracy. How to balance the two is the question, and I have no answer. A second point that I want to make is that suppose that we restrict the use of statistical evidence in criminal trials. And suppose that we restrict also the use of traditional forms of evidence in criminal trials. Statistical evidence because of the problems I've talked about. Traditional evidence because of the findings from psychology and cognitive science. So we restrict both of them. Well, the consequence will be that we will have very little evidence to use in criminal trials. So we cannot really restrict it, or I mean, we have to do something about it. So, in order to assess how harmful such restriction will be, and such gap, evidential gap that will result, will be, well, what is needed, and I think what is needed is an empirical research that would show how many wrongful conviction has resulted from because of unreliable traditional forms of evidence, and how much statistical evidence is used and will be used in criminal trials. And until we have this data about how much we need this kind of evidence, then we cannot really formulate any more specific policy recommendation. These data, I think, are partly available in the United States through the Innocent Project that has shown very clearly that one of the most widespread causes of wrongful conviction is eyewitness misidentification, but also failure in forensic techniques. There is, and again in the United States, there is not really any empirical data, I think, on how much statistical evidence is actually used. We know generally that it's on the move in a certain way, but the extent in which it is used is very difficult. Also because trials and cases are always very complex. But I'll end here. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Marcelo. So we've now had two presentations, one on sentencing and the other on evidence. I'd like to invite Jenna.
Thank you, Madhav. My presentation is on domestic violence cases and really looking at, I mean, it is in the panel on criminal law, but I think domestic violence cases present in India quite a unique situation because it presents a combination of civil and criminal law remedies going hand in hand. And so I'm going to just be focusing on this theme for today. Yeah. Why are we talking about DV cases? There is, since this act was enacted in 2005, it came into force in 2006. So it has been about 5 years. And there has been a lot said publicly by judges, by media, and by lawyers, by the bar, etc., saying that there is an allegation of misuse of the law. There are too many DV cases filed. Women are misusing the law and they're filing these cases where there is no genuine domestic violence. Courts are clogged by DV cases. Men are being harassed excessively, and this law is leading to breaking up of families. So my presentation today is to really see, we don't have that much data on this because no in-depth empirical work on this has been done. But with the limited data we have, I'd like to see, can we examine these allegations? Can we examine to see really what's happening with the DV Act on the ground, and to see if the DV Act is working or not working, or is it being implemented at least in the way that the law was envisaged? And are there problems? What are the problems, and how can we concretely take these problems forward? Are there solutions that we have? So, just to look at the Protection of Women from Domestic Violence Act, that's the acronym PWDVA. What is unique about this law? It's unique because it uses civil remedies to address criminal problems. Domestic violence was in India and actually elsewhere in many jurisdictions is seen as a criminal behavior or a criminal offense, and we had section 498A and other offenses of the IPC earlier. But we found that criminal law was not doing enough to offer women the immediate need of protection, shelter, remedies, monetary relief, medical relief, etc. And therefore, criminal law was not really useful to the women who were facing domestic violence. And therefore, the DV Act was enacted to bring about a combination of both civil law and criminal law. So the Act had civil law remedies such as injunction orders or protection orders, residence orders. These were all restraining orders, which are basically in our CPC. It had monetary reliefs, custody, compensation orders, which are traditionally civil law remedies. But it also has criminal law provisions like arrest, fine, punitive measures for breach of orders. And this was put in place because the traditional civil law mechanisms of the matrimonial laws, which deal with maintenance and custody, the orders were not being implemented. And therefore, and civil process of implementation like execution was not working. There's one study done in Tamil Nadu which showed that nearly 50% of execution petitions that were filed by women, only in about 53% of execution cases, which is the second round of litigation, was there any recovery of maintenance. So in 47%, even after getting a maintenance order and going to execution, the petitioner still didn't get the relief. And so to try and address that, the DV Act was drafted. Now, is this combination of civil, criminal, is it totally new? Has it not happened before? And I don't think that is so different. So, for example, section 125 of the CRPC, which is for maintenance, which is actually a criminal provision, is now is placed in family courts, which is a civil forum. And it has been done since the last 20 years or so, since the Family Courts Act was enacted, and that's fine. We have domestic law in other jurisdictions which also have civil criminal combinations. I think you have the 138 Act, the NI Act with section 138 for check dishonor, which is criminal, but the procedure is largely quite resembling a civil trial. So this, I would just like to emphasize on this because the civil criminal combination has actually led to some difficulties with implementation. Now, what does the Statement of Objects and Reasons of the DV Act say? I'd just like to quote and read it. It says, I'll just read the second para. It is therefore proposed to enact a law keeping in view the rights guaranteed under Articles 14, 15 and 21 of the Constitution to provide for a remedy under the civil law which is intended to protect the woman from being victims of domestic violence and to prevent the occurrence of domestic violence in society. So the preamble of the law says that it is a civil law, but it is placed in a criminal forum. And this has also been said by the courts. The Delhi High Court has actually clearly said and has recognized that the fact that it's a civil law. In a 2009 decision, the Delhi High Court said that it would be opposite to take note of the fact that though it is a piece of civil law, evidently in the interest of expedition and to cut down procedural delays, the forum provided for enforcement of rights under the PWDVA is that of the magistrate courts, constituted under the provisions of the CRPC. So the courts also recognize that though it's a civil law, the reason why it was placed in the magistrate court is for quick disposal. And again in Varsha Kapoor versus Union of India, again the Delhi High Court has said that since invoking criminal machinery under Section 498A IPC has serious ramifications, the need was felt to have civil law on domestic violence in as much as there was no law enabling the court to give protection orders, to give monetary reliefs in case women go to court complaining of domestic violence. And in order to provide such remedies, the DV Act has been enacted. So it was kind of well understood that the reason for this was that 498A, which was a pure criminal problem, was not giving much relief. And again, I wouldn't want to read all of it, but the Madras High Court has also said that the term civil law, twice used in the Act, is not an empty formality that would exemplify and demonstrate, display and convey that the proceedings at the first instance should be civil in nature. So this basically says that while this is in the magistrate's court, so magistrates have to have a civil proceeding. And so why was the forum of magistrates courts given in the Act? And that was really because A, to provide easy access, because you have magistrates in every jurisdiction as given in the CRPC, and you don't have district courts everywhere, and to make sure that someone facing violence can easily go to the nearest magistrate court. There was the issue of expeditious disposal, because civil courts were known for their delays. It would take years before civil cases disposed, but magistrate courts were quite fast. And at that time, the women's movement did not want to introduce yet another special court system like the family courts, because the family courts also had their own problems, and the special court structure didn't really work that well, and they wanted to use the existing courts. I'll just quickly go through this. So the law actually has a mix. It's a combination of a civil and criminal law. So you have civil law remedies that we discussed earlier of injunction, restraining orders, monetary orders, etc. You also have the provision of bringing these reliefs into other civil proceedings. The whole process of granting interim orders is only by affidavit, which is again a civil procedure. And service of notice is as per civil procedure and by criminal procedure. It has criminal law aspects, which is basically, it says that the proceeding shall be governed by the provisions of the CRPC. Jurisdiction is by the JMFC or the Metropolitan Magistrate under the CRPC. And breach of orders would be treated as an offense. And then the criminal law would kick in. Okay. So with this background, there are difficulties with implementation. Why are there difficulties? Some of the difficulties we see is that most judges, and here talking both out of experience and out of reports given, all judges, magistrates, sessions judges and high court judges who are dealing with criminal matters, before whom these cases are going, they are unfamiliar with this unique civil and criminal combination. They are unfamiliar that this is actually a civil law and the way in which orders have to be granted are by civil, by general norms of disposing of civil applications. And that's because traditionally civil law and criminal law have always been viewed in our practice as distinct categories. You have separate criminal lawyers who do only criminal law work, and you have civil lawyers. And so the same kind of dichotomy is there. The lawyers who take DV cases are also criminal lawyers, because the understanding is that because it's in a criminal court, you go to a criminal lawyer. So the profession, so this dichotomy is further reinforced in the practice of law and policing. So the profession is unable to deal with it. Judges are not that comfortable with this combination. Police as well, because the police is integrally involved in the act at various stages. So the police also do not understand that there are civil law aspects involved. So while this has happened, we see some procedural developments. In Karnataka, for example, while the whole idea was to ensure that you have every magistrate, according to a jurisdiction, dealing with domestic violence cases, what the chief magistrate has done is, using the provision of the CRPC, has listed DV cases to go only before a few specialized courts. So the problem of ghettoization, which we wanted to do away, which the law wanted to do away with, has actually been reinforced. So what has happened, and I'm talking about this only with respect to Karnataka, is that out of about 20 or 25 magistrates' courts, only 3 or 4 courts have now domestic violence cases being filed. Those courts are clogged up, and now those magistrates, because they have a lot of other cases as well, they list domestic violence cases for hearing only once or twice a week. And on those cases, on those days, it's chock-a-block, there's no time because there are a million proceedings to carry on. And the whole idea of having easy access, emergency orders is really quite difficult to envisage if you're going to have a hearing only once a week. There are further problems, and again I'm talking only with the Karnataka example. Procedurally, the DV Act envisaged that you would have ex parte interim orders and regular interim orders for interim reliefs like protection orders or residence orders or maintenance orders. In Karnataka, we have a 2009 decision by the Karnataka High Court where the High Court has given a specific ruling, and I would like to read out, where they've said that the trial judges are directed to reconsider applications filed by the respondent for interim relief, applying the procedure prescribed for trial in summons cases under the CRPC after giving due opportunity to the petitioner and respondent to lead such evidence as they may choose, and the trial judge to dispose of the matter, that is just the application, within an outer limit of 3 months. Now this is, I would just like to counterpose this with actually what the Act says. The Act says that the entire petition should be, there should be an endeavour made to dispose of it within 2 months. Now what the Karnataka High Court has done is that for all interim orders, which in a regular civil procedure would be disposed based on affidavits given by both parties, and there would probably be arguments, and then you pass an order. To that, the court has said no, since this is a criminal, the procedure is criminal, we would say that you have even an interim order disposal by evidence by a criminal trial. And the reasoning given in this case, this was a case where monetary relief or maintenance was sought. The reasoning given by Justice Javed Rahim, who passed this order, was that under the CRPC, what is the procedure given? Procedure is based on a summons case, or for summons case, it is where the offence is punishable with 1 year imprisonment, and in the DV Act there are no offences, they are just remedies. But a breach of a remedy, breach of an order would be an offence, and so and the punishment for that offence is 1 year. So he said, since a breach of an order would, and because of that decision in Karnataka since 2009, no interim orders are being passed by magistrates without a full-fledged evidence. So this really kind of nullifies the main purpose of the law. If we look at generally problems with court proceedings, generally, there are huge delays, and I will try and substantiate that with a little bit of data that we have. We don't have too much. The Act says that there should be an effort made to dispose of matters within 2 months, but even in 1 year, none of that is really possible. Interim orders are quite difficult to obtain. Ex parte orders are possible, but interim orders are very, very difficult, especially with judgments like the Karnataka High Court being mandatory. Breach of orders, cognizance is not taken easily by the magistrate courts, and compensation orders, all the orders studied and received, there's been an in-depth study done by the Lawyers Collective in their monitoring and evaluation report. Even those, while exact numbers are not there, but they show that compensation orders are rarely passed. Even when courts give a finding that domestic violence was there, but compensation for domestic violence is rarely granted. And I think a problem with that is also because compensation is not really seen as part of the criminal procedure. So I will just try and show a few statistics. The first column is this. These figures are from the Lawyers Collective Monitoring and Evaluation reports of 2007 and 2011. Now 2007 was the first year that the Act was studied, because the Act was brought into force in 2006. So the first report studies the performance of the Act in the first 1 year. And we have the number of cases filed state-wise. The highest number of cases are probably in Kerala and Rajasthan. And I would just like to show another figure. For Tamil Nadu, we can see there are 37 cases. And in brackets, I have added a figure of mine, which is 1592. Now, 1592 is a figure that I've got from another study done by a group called Ekta. And that is actually of cases in the family court. So, when you had, possibly this is because it's the first year, so we should make some leeway for that. But still, if you look at the difference of the number of domestic violence cases, the number of matrimonial cases filed, there's a huge difference, and there's a huge number of matrimonial cases filed. Compared to that, if we see how the numbers have grown, we've got some figures from some states in 2010-11, which is the last report of the Lawyers Collective. We can see that Andhra Pradesh, it has increased from 731 to 1174. In Karnataka, it's from 124, it increased in 5 years to 1013. In Kerala, it's actually reduced to 631. MP, it's increased to 882. And Maharashtra, it has actually a big jump to 2433. So these are just the figures that we have. Now, can we say from these figures that there is any misuse of the Act? I think those, to verify whether there has been misuse, I think we need more empirical data to show that what has happened in these cases. The numbers are not uniquely large, and in those cases, how long has it taken to proceed to complete them? What is the relief given? Have women got relief or not? Are they false cases? Has domestic violence not been found? Unless you get such data, I think it is not. We should take these comments and allegations with a victim and the court, and a protection officer can go to court directly on behalf of the woman and file a complaint. Magistrates have large duties under the Act. They have the duty of informing the woman of all the different remedies she has available. Police officers have obligations. There are requirements of shelter homes being set up. There are requirements of medical facilities being registered, and to provide legal aid, the Legal Services Authority. And all these actors have several obligations under the Act. And what has happened with all these institutions? So we can see with the information available that protection officers have actually not been established uniformly in all states. And in fact, even till date, apart from Karnataka, there is in no state is there a permanent cadre of protection officers put up. You have other government officials who have other duties taking up also the duty of protection officers. From one of the articles by Bhumika Jamb, got the information that on a report based on 2010, only 287 shelter homes in the states have been set up. Now we can see that these are hardly, it doesn't even cover one shelter home in each district in the country. So we don't have enough shelter homes set up. And this is a problem with budget allocation under the Act. If you have to have protection officers, if you have to have the institutional setup, there has to be budget allocation. And from the same paper, this information is available. So we see state-wise budget estimate, BE stands for budget estimate, and these are the only states which even have a budget allocation. Other states don't even have a budget allocation for the DV Act. And we can see that even the percentage, the first column is in lakhs, the budget estimate, the next is the actual expenditure in lakhs again, and the last we see is the percentage of utilization. So we see that apart from only 2 or 3 states which have actually fully utilized the budgets, a majority of the states, while they have made a budget allocation, have actually not utilized the budget for making infrastructure for the Act. In addition to this, the Act, the legislation actually has mandatory requirements for trainings to be done for police officers and judges, for protocols, for codes to be put in place. So you can have protocols for service delivery like issuance of notice, issuance of interim orders, basic protocols can be put in place, and actually they should be put in place under the Act to ensure that the Act functions, but even after 5 years that hasn't been done. And the Act itself talks about a periodical review to be done, and we still don't have that. So, yeah, so this was to see whether it would just be the trainings, review, and those provisions which would make things work, or do we need more empirical data and studies to be done to see what other substantive issues there are. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna, for that very interesting presentation. Can I ask this team to come up for the final presentation of this meeting?
Good afternoon, everyone. So my paper is, this piece is socioeconomic indicators and crime rates. And initially I named it finding correlations, and then I changed it to looking for correlations. And you'll understand why I did that towards the end of the presentation. But basically what I'm looking to do through this presentation is put before you a lot of data, not necessarily observations or conclusions from this data, because I think it's too early. And a lot of work needs to be done, but what I will put before you is a lot of data and a few graphs to try and understand how crime rates vary across the states in India in terms of socioeconomic indicators. So a little bit in terms of background, why is there a need for such a study, and why is such a study important? Both the speakers before me spoke about the lack of empirical data, and so they couldn't come to very important conclusions with regard to their papers because of said lack of data. So it's become evident that we're moving away. There has been a very systematic shift away from viewing law, and criminal law in particular, as an autonomous entity. And we've understood that we need to look at law in the context of social indicators, in the context of economic indicators, so as to better inform our policy decisions, so as to better inform the enforcement of these policy decisions. That's the first reason. The second, and this deals specifically with crimes, and my paper will deal with crimes against women, so this fits in well, is protection from violence may be thought of as one of the capabilities that contribute towards quality of life. And so it is intrinsically a matter of public action. Very simply, this says that it's important that I don't get assaulted on my way to work, because that is essential for me functioning well as an individual in this society. And as we know that capabilities are intrinsically linked not just to how well I do or whether I'm from a wealthy family, but they are also linked to where I stay and how the people are, whether the people around me are well-to-do or not. So looking at it from a perspective of capabilities, also socioeconomic indicators become very, very relevant to an analysis of criminal law and crime data. The last thing is there are very few statistic statistical analyses that have been carried out with regard to Indian criminal data. The few that I did come across are the three that I've listed. One very early attempt to analyze crime data in terms of socioeconomic indicators was carried out by Baldev Raj Nair, and although it looked more at violent crimes rather than crimes against women in particular, it was an important study, and more recently people have been writing about it in blogs, etc., but a very in-depth analysis has been carried out by Drez and Khera. However, the two things that are very relevant with regard to these statistical analyses as well is that more often than not they focus on violent crimes, such as murder, rape, etc. Very rarely do they focus on specific crimes, as in crimes against marginalized groups, and I will be talking about crimes against women. And the reason they do that is because a lot of anomalies that occur in with regard to crimes against marginalized groups don't really occur with regard to violent crimes such as murder. So, for example, while a woman might not, really report molestation or maybe eve teasing, people do generally report murder. The other thing is that crimes against women in particular have been studied a lot through field studies. So, smaller areas have been focused on and analyses have been carried out. So, I came across a lot of studies on, rural areas in Gujarat, rural areas in Rajasthan, where studies have been carried out with regard to crimes against women, and they've analyzed the same. But a sort of nationwide analysis is really missing, so to speak. So simply the aim of collecting all this data is to identify correlations, if at all they exist, between socioeconomic indicators and crime rates across states in India. What is the scope of this study? I'm looking at what can generally be categorized as crimes against women, and I've divided them into three classes: sexual crimes, which include rape, kidnapping and abduction, molestation, sexual harassment; domestic crimes, that's homicide for dowry, dowry deaths, etc. Torture, this generally is cruelty that's committed by the husband or the husband's family. And I've included the Dowry Prohibition Act under this because more often than not, when a complaint is made for cruelty by the husband, a complaint is also made under the Dowry Prohibition Act. And the third class is special legislations. These deal with Immoral Traffic Prevention Act, Indecent Representation of Women's Act, and Commission of Sati Prevention Act. The data that I've relied on, I've collected from the Crime in India Statistics 2010. These are statistics that are collected by the NCRB, or the National Crime Records Bureau. They collect this data from police records, and the first time this report came out was in 1953, and 1995-97 onwards is when they started dealing with crimes against women as a very specific category. Also, that little note there that I've left out the offense for importation of girls because the data on that is very unclear and inadequate. Which are the socioeconomic indicators I'm looking at? Well, there are millions of indicators that we can actually look at, but I've restricted myself to these. First is GDP per capita. This is rupees per annum. Sex ratio, literacy, rural-urban distribution of population, which is basically how much percentage of a state's population is within the rural areas and how much percentage is in urban areas. Next is labor force participation. This is basically out of 1,000 people, how many of them are actually engaged in what we call organized labor, so to speak. And the last one is police strength. The reason I've included this, although it's not a socioeconomic indicator, is because it helps to explain some of the, well, I can only put it as crazy behavior that we see towards the latter part of this presentation. Right. The methodology, as I pointed out, there are three. I've divided the crimes against women into three classes: the sexual crimes, domestic crimes, and crimes under special legislation. In the first stage, the graphs basically are scatter graphs, which will compare crime rate and various socioeconomic indicators individually. So we look at how does crime rate behave when, let's say, the sex ratio increases or literacy rate increases. On the second stage, and this is where we need far more analysis, and perhaps we might also need some amount of economic analysis, is when we are comparing a combined effect of socioeconomic factors. And what I will try to do is try to divide states, take a few states and divide them into developed, less developed, and mid-level developed, and try to see whether the categorization or the crime-wise distribution is different or varies across with their development. What are the limitations? Now, in a study like this, limitations are very, very important because they almost like act as a handicap. The first is skepticism regarding accuracy of data and data reporting methods. A lot has been written about how NCRB does not collect its data in the best way possible, does not also report its data in the best way possible. So there is a lot of skepticism in that regard, so we proceed with caution. The second problem, and this is a very, very important problem, is underreporting. We will never know how many crimes are actually committed. We'll only know how many crimes are actually reported. So sometimes, let's say, if a particular crime rate increases or decreases, it can also be an indicator of women just being more empowered to come out and report these crimes, not necessarily be an indicator of the fact that the state is more violent or more dangerous for women. So this is a very, very big limitation. The second, and this was pointed out by Drees and Khera in their analysis, is the other problem of taking a static view. So all of this data has been collected from a particular point of time, but we know that rates of crime change with changes in society. So for example, whilst there might not be a very specific correlation between poverty and murder rate at a particular point of time, you might find that at times of recession, there are more violent crimes. So we haven't, in this study at least, I haven't been able to take a more dynamic view, which would require maybe data from the last 30 years or so, for us to analyze how, with the change in time, the crime rate would change. So this is the problem of taking the static view. The last thing is state-level data versus district-level data. Right in the beginning, in 1975, Nair pointed out that it would be more accurate and useful to use district-level data, but we've restricted ourselves to state-level data here, and also district-level data is quite complicated to read and also to find. Right. So some general information, just so that we can keep this at the back of our minds as we proceed with the presentation. Crimes against women. Incidence and rate across Indian states. This graph, the map basically tells you how dangerous / violent particular states are as compared to others. Throughout this analysis, we'll be focusing on crime rates because people feel that authors suggest that crime rates are a more accurate way to look at crime data. So we noticed that the more, let's say, the states that have a larger incidence of crimes against women are states like Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, Andhra Pradesh. Basically, all the states in yellow are the ones that have the highest incidence of crimes against women. And to your right-hand side are the states that have the highest rate of crimes against women. You see that there is a variation to some extent, although Rajasthan and Madhya Pradesh show a very high rate as well as incidence of crimes against women. We see that Maharashtra has fallen out of the picture in that regard. And whilst Andhra Pradesh is still around. And we see that West Bengal, although it doesn't have a very high incidence of crimes against women, it has an extremely high rate, and the same holds true for Assam as well. So then we move to just to understand what are the various crimes we're looking at and how they're distributed. The various crimes, as I pointed out earlier, we see the largest percentage distribution is in fact cruelty by husband, by the husband or his relatives, and that is the largest percentage. Following that are the cases of molestation, and then the cases of kidnapping and abduction, and then rape, and the others seem to be rather uniform in terms of sexual harassment, dowry, that pretty much the same. But the crimes under special legislations, they contribute almost a negligible amount to the crime-wise distribution of crimes against women. And the data suggests that, for example, there has been no crimes have been reported under the Sati Prevention Act, and very negligible number of crimes have been reported under the Indecent Representation of Women's Act, etc. So a quick state-wise ranking, we see that for rape, the highest incidence is in Madhya Pradesh, whereas the highest rate is Mizoram. Kidnapping, Uttar Pradesh with the highest incidence, almost 18.4%, and Delhi has the highest rate with 9.5.
What's the difference between rate and incidence?
Right, rate, sorry, I should have done that earlier. Incidence, basically the number of crimes that are reported. rate is the number of crimes reported per 1,000 people. So it's it kind of gives you how many crimes versus the number of people in a particular state. The reason it's more accurate is because clearly states that are more populous will have a, well, more often than not will have a higher incidence, more reporting, but that's not necessarily true for rape. So, which is why rate is more, which is why rate is a more accurate indicator. So, yeah, torture, West Bengal with the highest incidence and Tripura with the highest rate. Now, this is something that I found extremely odd in all of the data. Tripura seems to be really high in terms of all its crime rates, although it's highest for molestation and torture, that's cruelty by the husband. Tripura has very, very, very high rate of crimes against women, and this is across all crimes. Although I wasn't able to find any data which tells us why this is happening, it seems to be happening across, and this is true even for 2008, 2009, and all of this data is 2010. So molestation, again, Madhya Pradesh makes a reappearance with 16.4%, Tripura again highest rate. Sexual harassment, Andhra Pradesh, also highest rate in Andhra Pradesh. It's interesting to note that Andhra Pradesh has a very high incidence, although it's not up here, it has a high rate of crime in terms of crimes against women with regard to especially domestic crimes, that is the cruelty by husband, etc. Extremely dowry deaths, very, very high rates are noted in the state of Andhra Pradesh. Immoral Traffic Prevention Act, Tamil Nadu has the highest incidence, whereas Daman and Diu has the highest rate. Indecent Representation of Women's Act, again Andhra Pradesh, 84.1%, although it's not really fair to say that it's such a high percentage because generally the incidence of crimes under this particular act are low across the nation. Dowry Prohibition Act, again Andhra Pradesh, 22.9%, and the rate is in Odisha. Sati Prevention Act, as I told you earlier, there was no case registered in 2010 or in 2009. Overall crime rate versus crimes against women. This is just to put things into perspective in terms of whether or not states that are generally held to be violent, that is, have more incidents of crime, are also bad for women in terms of higher incidents of crimes against women. It seems to be generally true, barring two exceptions. So Tripura, Andhra Pradesh and Haryana have very high crime rates against women but relatively low overall crime rates, whereas Daman and Diu, Pondicherry and Gujarat are characterized by low levels of crimes against women but overall high rates. So it's not very wise to say that if a particular state is generally in popular perception held to be more violent, it also has a high incidence of crimes against women. Socioeconomic indicators. So this I'll be looking at the socioeconomic indicators from here. This graph basically tries to show you a relative development status of states using the Human Development Index. We see across states that states like Delhi, Himachal Pradesh, Kerala, Punjab have a much higher Human Development Index marker as compared to others, whereas the other states such as Maharashtra and Maharashtra, Andhra Pradesh, etc. fall in the more median category. A simple state-wise ranking. We've looked at GDP. Goa is right up there. Sex ratio, we notice in a lot of these things, Kerala ranks really, really high. So sex ratio, Kerala. Overall literacy, also Kerala. Female literacy, also Kerala. Himachal Pradesh does really well in terms of labor force participation as compared to the other states. And Mizoram has a very high police strength. Now, this one thing that's interesting to note is that a lot of the states that have a higher GDP or generally considered to be well-to-do states don't have a very high actual police strength. Now, reasons could be plenty for this, but the literature doesn't seem to suggest why there is this sort of correlation. One would assume that states that are better off economically would invest more in police and police infrastructure, but that does not seem to be the case with a lot of states. Right. So coming to the main part of this presentation, which are individual correlations. We'll start with GDP per capita. Now, I spoke about capabilities earlier. And one of the things that Dres and Khera say is that although a lot of capabilities such as nutrition, literacy, longevity are very positively correlated with economic growth, protection from violence is not necessarily one of them. However, increase in other capabilities such as literacy, etc., does have some amount of effect on the crime rate. The graphs that come next will show you that sexual crimes and domestic crimes decrease with increase in GDP, whereas crimes under special legislations increase. So this is scatter plot which looks at GDP on the x-axis and the various crime rates on the y-axis. What we note is for sexual crimes and for domestic crimes, there is a clear downward movement as in a negative correlation between GDP and the crime rate. That is, as GDP increases, the crime rate seems to be decreasing, although the gradient is not spectacular, as in it is largely uniform. There's only a slight gradient. However, crimes under special legislations, we see that there is quite a steep gradient, and that too in the opposite direction. Now, the data seems to suggest that the crimes under special legislations are those crimes which, like of course, there's Immoral Traffic Prohibition Act and the Indecent Representation of Women's Act. The states like Goa, Delhi and Maharashtra, they have a very high incidence of these kind of crimes, and they also have high GDP. The literature seems to suggest that in these states there is more publication, therefore there is a greater chance of crimes under Indecent Representation of Women's Act, and also these states are marked by higher levels of prostitution, which is why the Immoral Traffic Prohibition Act comes in. But for sexual crimes and domestic crimes, it seems to follow the general notion that as a state gets better, its policing infrastructure and it's because the other capabilities improve, the crime rate also decreases. Next is sex ratio. A number of studies have been carried out. With regard to sex ratio and other violent crimes, and there seems to be a very robust negative correlation between violent crimes such as murder and the male-female ratio. But such a strong correlation is not there with regard to crimes against women. In fact, we see it the other way around. That is, sexual crimes and domestic crimes have increased, but crimes under special legislations have decreased. Now, some authors point to the fact that in societies that have better sex ratio, women feel more confident to report crimes. So, as I spoke about, one of our limitations is the problem of underreporting. We could, very safely say perhaps that the reason why we see an increase in domestic crimes and sexual crimes with an increase in sex ratio could be because just more women are coming out and actually reporting these crimes being committed. So, that's traditionally we've understood also that Haryana, Rajasthan and Punjab are the ones that because of having a low sex ratio, they are more violent societies. And although this is true with regard to murder rates, it doesn't seem to be true with regard to crimes against women. This could also be because, as the authors have pointed out, in these societies, women don't feel empowered enough to come out and report these crimes. Literacy, the data lends a lot of support to the hypothesis that education exercises a moderating influence on criminal violence, and this is also true for crimes against women. We notice that individual male and female literacy levels have varying effects on the crime rate. Although increase in female literacy doesn't have a very impact on the crime rate, an increase in male literacy does. As the graphs will show you, I've stereotyped a little bit, so the pink dots are female literacy and the blue dots are male literacy. If you notice that in the first graph, that is sexual crimes, the crime rate remains rather uniform, that is the pink line remains rather uniform as in with regard to female literacy, but the gradient is noticed with regard to male literacy, as in as male literacy increases, we see that crimes against women are decreasing. Again, the opposite is seen with regard to special legislations, and this is very simply explained by the fact that knowledge of special legislations is very minimal in a lot of states that have low literacy levels. So the police personnel there and even the complainant would not think to put a particular crime under the special legislation in states that don't have a high literacy level, but these special legislations would be, used in states that have higher literacy levels. Urbanizations. Now it's generally felt that in the more urban centers or in the states there is more crime against women. But the observations that we've seen from the data seem to show otherwise. However, there is a word of caution that this is state-wise data and not city-wise data. But cities such as metropolitan cities such as Delhi, Mumbai, Hyderabad and Bangalore do show a higher incidence of crimes against women. These are the graphs that look at urbanization. We notice that as urbanization increases, both sexual crimes and crimes against both sexual crimes and domestic crimes show a marked decrease. Labour force participation, there's a steep increase in sexual crimes with an increase in labour force participation. This, I mean, a lot of authors have said this, a lot of studies say this as well, that women are just simply more vulnerable to violence when they go out to work. And an increase is also noticed in domestic crime rate. And some of the studies, especially studies that were carried out, field studies that were carried out in villages, etc., seem to suggest that once a woman starts working, there's an increase in domestic crime because she's either not paying attention to her household, believed to not be paying attention to her household, or she's beginning to question her unequal status because she's an earning member as well. So we notice this very clear correlation as labour force participation increases, there is a marked increase in crimes against women. This is very true for sexual crimes, but largely uniform for domestic crimes. With police strength, we note that sexual crimes increase with increase in police strength. This observation calls into question some of the claims made by authors regarding increase in crime rate on account of increased reporting. So you're looking at more the police, the more there's an increase in sexual crime rate, but there is a decrease in domestic crime rate. This could possibly be because there are more policemen within a particular area, so either the husbands or the family of the husband feel more threatened to commit the crimes because there is, for example, a police station in that particular area. So this could be one of the reasons. I'll go quickly through this because there's very little to say with regard to combined correlations because it requires more analysis. What is the effect of combinations of indicators on crime rates? Here I've basically put all the socioeconomic indicators in one place to try to understand if at all we see any pattern, so to speak. So you notice on the x-axis is the state rank, that is the states have been ranked in terms of how well off they are in terms of female literacy, GDP rank, urbanization, etc. We notice that the more there doesn't seem to be a very clear-cut correlation between how well a state is doing in terms of GDP or female literacy or urbanization together. We notice that there is a large-scale scattering either in states that are very well-to-do or in states that are really badly off. But is there any clear-cut marker? Can we find a clear-cut marker from merely graphs? No, not really for sexual crimes. For domestic crimes, on the other hand, there seems to be some sort of trend that we can notice. There is a downward trend. As in the most of the states, you see a large clustering between the 0 to 10 mark here, which goes to show that states that are generally well off in terms of GDP, literacy, etc., a combination of those factors act to pull down domestic crime rates in these states. Crimes under special legislations again show a trend but they show an upward trend. So you see there's a large clustering of the states between 0 and 30. Most of them are at the bottom grade, and then there are some that are very high up. So I mean this could be a factor of whether the states are generally dealing more with crimes against special acts, or they're just generally more aware, or their police infrastructure is such that they are keeping track of these specialized crimes. Lastly, I look at distribution of crimes across states classified by levels of development. So looking at states that generally rank higher in terms of GDP, literacy, urbanization, sex ratio, we broadly divided the states into three. So states with high development, now I've picked 4, Delhi, Goa, Kerala and Punjab. We noticed that although Goa seems to have a very uniform distribution of the different types of crimes, we see that for Delhi, Kerala and Punjab, and this is true even for other states that are generally well-to-do, the cruelty by husband and relatives, that is the crimes that is domestic crimes, are extremely high in these 3 states. And so we see that states with high development, this seems to be their very strong marker, is that domestic crime rate is very, very high. The other type of crime that's high is kidnapping and abduction and molestation. That's marked in purple. You see that the percentage that is covered by the purple area is extremely high in these states that have high development. States with mid-level development, these are states like Maharashtra, Himachal Pradesh, Haryana, Gujarat. We notice again that domestic crimes are extremely high in this state, but here we see an increase in sexual harassment and eve teasing rate. Now that's the marker that's in pink. I'll go back to the previous slide. We see that there's hardly any pink with regard to Delhi or Punjab, little bit in Kerala and some amount in Goa. But with all of the mid-level development states, we see that there is a sizable proportion of eve teasing and sexual harassment. Lastly, states with low development, here I've picked Bihar, Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh and Uttar Pradesh. Here we notice the yellow portion, which is the rate of crimes under the Dowry Prohibition Act. As we noticed in the previous two states, I'll go back to the previous slide, there was no yellow at all in these states, which is to say that negligible amount of crimes were reported under the Dowry Prohibition Act. But here states with low level of development show a high incidence, a high rate of crimes under the Dowry Prohibition Act. But compared to the previous two types of states, we see here in Madhya Pradesh, even in Bihar, the domestic violence rate seems to be decreasing. Now, I'm not sure, and the studies seem to suggest that the reason is in these states, women are not empowered enough to actually report domestic crimes. Either they are not empowered enough, or they don't even know that what is being done to them is in fact a type of crime. So that is the analysis that some studies seek to give in order to explain this decrease, so to speak, in domestic crimes. Concluding remarks. Though there is a correlation observed between crime rate and most socioeconomic indicators, as we saw from the graphs, we could see upward and downward trends with regard to specific socioeconomic indicators. It's very difficult to explain them really. We don't know why, whether it's because of an increased incidence of crime or because women are just more empowered to report this crime. The same is not true for violent crimes, because we can more or less say that for the most part violent crimes go reported, and there are fewer violent crimes than crimes against women which go unreported. This difficulty is partially caused by the anomalous effect of crime reporting versus actual crime commission, as I pointed out right in the beginning. The last thing I'd like to say is definitely there is a need to study these correlations in greater detail before we can draw any meaningful conclusions regarding the reasons for high rates of crimes against women in particular states. What I started with is the importance of such empirical studies so that we can identify why these crimes occur and possibly identify which socioeconomic indicators should be given a push in order to decrease the rate. To come to a conclusion like that, we need much more analysis. This is only the first step, which is basically getting the data together and trying to understand how crime rates relate to and react with socioeconomic indicators. But a greater analysis is required in order to understand how a combination of socioeconomic factors can affect a particular state, leading to increase in the rate of crimes against women.
So we'll just take very few questions, and then each of the panelists can hopefully just briefly respond.
This in terms of the definition of crimes against women. I was wondering in terms of kidnapping is a crime, for example. Yeah. Often it's used against runaway couples.
Yes.
So there's a bit of a problem there in terms of whether it is a crime against a woman.
Right.
And similarly, even the entire question of ITPA,
Yes.
the Immoral Trafficking Prevention
Yes.
Act, the 8B offence
Right.
is often, it's not really a crime against a woman. Woman is the victim.
Right.
And you're filing the case against her. But actually it's not a crime against a woman. So what is the crime against women itself? In some of these legislations,
Right.
might be a slightly difficult question.
Yes.
See, what you're doing is very, very difficult. It's quite amazing that you can put together all this. But as you began by saying, I think the skepticism about the data is serious, particularly with National Crime Records Bureau, because in fact it's not even district level. If you want to do serious stuff, you need literally not just tehsil, but you need thana level data. I mean, that's really where all the fun begins. If you ever manage to get hold of bits of the aggregation, because even the whole categorization of urban, all of that. So one just on the kind of data side. The second on the methodology side, the one thing we now know, right, about crime studies globally is essentially the possibility of selection bias in variables you pick is very, very high. So standardly, the statistical stuff will do about 200, 300 variables before it comes to even any modest conclusions about causation. I mean, you could do liquor consumption, you could do, divorce rates, you could, all right. So from that point of view, I mean, one of the reasons I think the stuff is not as well developed in India is because the threshold of variables you need to be able to get to causal stories is actually very, very high. Otherwise, sort of, it's interesting but leaves you completely indifferent. Yes.
Yeah, this is just sort of a comment on Marcelo's presentation and our presentation. As in they talked about sentencing, eyewitnesses. And I just wanted to tell everyone, as in recently Columbia Human Rights Law Review came up with this sort of book, as part of their article journal, called Los Carlos Tocuyo's, which essentially documents, I think for the first time in their history, how there was an execution of a wrong, an innocent person was executed, and how basically there were these, the person who was killed, Carlos Hernandez, and the actual perpetrator of the crime, Carlos de Luna, and they track it like it's some 436-page volume, and they actually go on to track how this was, all of the conviction and the execution was based on the eyewitness of one person. And both these people look exactly, split, they look very similar. So which is why they use Tocuyo's, which in Spanish means twins, apparently. So I just thought this is really interesting because you're talking about eyewitness evidence. And this is apparently the first time where they've actually documented, it's a 6-year project which they just completed, where they documented, where they talk to police investigators, prosecution, the eyewitnesses themselves, to say that how, and this was in context of the death penalty obviously, how they convicted and executed an innocent man just on the basis of one eyewitness evidence. So I just thought this would be interesting, and given that we've been talking about sentencing and eyewitnesses. And the second thing I just want to point out is, like when you talk about sentencing disparity, so there's also this whole feminist perspective, which you can say get into death penalty sentencing. So if you actually look at how the Supreme Court has treated, say, a case of murder where an old man was murdered, murder caused due to a property dispute. Whereas a murder caused, say, in pursuance of a crime against a woman, there's actually very different perspectives which come about, and a lot of papers have been written on that. I just want to point that.
Any other?
Yeah, this is a question for Jaina. You spoke about how under the Domestic Violence Act, there are civil remedies provided against the accused as well. I was just wondering, as a matter of information, are those remedies available even under the common law, the general civil law in India? That's what I want to know.
So last question.
I'm from Pondicherry. You have given a data in Tamil Nadu, it's Pondicherry. Some more crime is happening there. It's not due to women actually. In Tamil Nadu and Pondicherry, they are having a gold ornaments. Mainly it's gold snatching case, chain snatching cases are reported there. So same crime is committed. It is actually economic basis, not for torturing women. So it is my idea.
Actually, a lot of those remedies are, some of them are available in existing matrimonial law, civil law. For example, you do have maintenance provisions in existing matrimonial law, and you do have the option, you do have the availability of civil injunctions, which there's no reason to say that why can't you get a restraining order under CPC, But it is just that a lot, and compensation, okay, under tort, you can say that yes, we do have a provision for compensation. But it, apart from maintenance and custody orders, other reliefs are like pushing the boundaries in civil courts, they are not laid out. So it makes it that much more difficult to convince a court that, you know, an Order 39 CPC provision can allow you to give me a restraining order or a no contact order. So it's that much more tough.
Thanks.
I'll answer your question first. And the reason I classified the data the way I did is because very simply that's how the NCRB likes us to understand the data. And you're absolutely right, because sometimes you might be kidnapped because of ransom and you could just turn out to be a woman. So it's not really a crime against women. And of course you point out the cases of elopement, which are a lot of the times just placed under kidnapping and abduction by the girl's family. So yes, I mean you're absolutely right in that, and there's no reason why we shouldn't be classifying it any other way, but the fact that we don't have data to classify it in any other way. Also, immoral traffic, that act, I don't think that act really comes under crimes against women, just like you pointed out. But a lot of the since the NCRB data categorizes it under crimes against women, a lot of the subsequent study that has been done by other authors, you know, whether it was the Drees Kira article that I referred to, or the even Nayar's piece in 1975, would like us to believe that trafficking and prostitution related legislations are best understood as to come under crimes against women. So simply that's to you. The other two comments, I think I'd like to answer them together. In terms of the collection of data, yes, I don't think we can rely on NCRB at all, because you're right, it doesn't go down to the Thana level where in fact we should be focusing. But a lot of the by viewing the NCRB data, a lot of studies have been carried out, as I referred to these smaller field studies that have been done in villages, in Gujarat, in Rajasthan. Some studies have been done in Tamil Nadu. In fact, Tamil Nadu, there have been quite a few studies which look at a smaller area and try to see what is the incidence of crimes against women, etc., etc. The reason I wanted to bring this data, in whichever form it is, although it is, extremely rough, is to try to understand is to try to basically bring forth that it's time we started looking at this data. A lot of the articles, a lot of the literature on crimes against women just goes on yada 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 about social factors, but doesn't really put any numbers out there. So I mean, here are the numbers, right? So we're looking at numbers. We know that there is a causal relation of some sort between these various things. So it's time that, and even the studies that I refer to were few and far between. So I think the time has come now to maybe talk about numbers, even with regard to crimes against women, because a lot of the times crimes against women is a subject that is dealt with not in a very empirical fashion. So I mean, although this data is rough and there's skepticism about it, I thought maybe we should talk about it. Dealing with the gentleman's question, that is also one of the things that I think I spoke about earlier, is when certain crimes are committed against women, they need not be committed by virtue of them being women. They could just be committed for, monetary gain, which is your chain snatching example. A lot of the time when chain snatching cases are reported by women, they get reported along with other crimes, so-called crimes against women, such as, molestation or eve teasing, etc. He touched me whilst he snatched my chain, so the policeman would put it under that category. These are problems we have with the manner in which the data is collected, and unless we start understanding this and maybe trying to change the way in which we collect data and understand data, that's not really going to change. So I think the big problem with this kind of study is the fact that we don't really know much. And I mean, but this is a start to maybe coax people into trying to get to know more.
Thanks. Now I think we break for lunch. Upstairs. Okay.
When do we resume?
2:30. So
2:30.
in half an hour.
Okay.